I never explicitly set out to write a cozy fantasy novel. And so I was utterly heartbroken. I was going to have to betray myself, shoehorn a romance into this just so it could have a buzzword slapped on the Goodreads page. The problem arises, I think, when we become siloed. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm going to be speaking all about cozy fantasy, romantasy, and the real problem with these two genres. If you're new here, hello, welcome. My name is Christy. My debut novel is coming out next year in July. It's called Theodora's Tea Shop, and it is a slightly gothic, slightly cozy fantasy novel about a young woman who runs off to the city of Aliaster because she wants to learn magic from an enigmatic and charming witch who happens to have a lot of secrets. There's demons and spirits. It's atmospheric. I'm very proud of the book, and it's going to be out next year, and pre-orders are available, and you can add it on Goodreads, and I think that's my whole spiel done. In this video, I particularly wanted to talk about cozy fantasy from the perspective of an author whose book was tagged as cozy fantasy, not against my will, but kind of to my surprise. So what is cozy fantasy and what is romantasy? So kicking off with cozy fantasy. So if we look at Google Trends, cozy fantasy was fairly non-existent before the pandemic. Essentially from 2022 onwards, it started steadily and quickly growing in interest, and then in August of this year, for some reason, it skyrocketed again. But let's keep in mind that cozy fantasy, which is essentially a genre of fantasy stories that have lower stakes, that tend to have slower moments, more heartfelt themes, more imagery around domestic paraphernalia like homes and tea and food. You're less likely to have big bold battles like you get in The Lord of the Rings, for example. You're more likely to have in these books these smaller, more heartfelt moments. Cozy fantasy is a niche within a niche. So those of us who know what cozy fantasy is, who are going out of our way to read these books, we're operating within a smaller subset of the greater fantasy genre. Romantasy, on the other hand, is a completely different kettle of fish. Romantasy is essentially what it says on the tin. It's romance novels that have fantasy settings or they have magic, and it kind of depends on the specific romantasy novel, how much of that novel is taken up by world building, magic systems, all of the typical fantasy stuff, and how much of that novel is taken up by the romance. But generally the romance is fairly far forward in terms of what we're actually reading about in the meat of the story. If we look at the Google Trends for romantasy, however, we can see that it's shot up way more in popularity than cozy fantasy. I was in a bookshop the other day, like 3 days ago, and I was so shocked and amazed that the fantasy section was actually significantly smaller than the romantasy section that was right next to it. Like there was a wall of romantasy books, whereas fantasy was just getting a little bit smaller in comparison. Unlike cozy fantasy, this is not a niche within a niche. It's more like a Venn diagram. We have two genres overlapping here, which means that romantasy can pull readers from both genres. And this is really, really significant because the romance genre is absolutely huge. Romance readers are very dedicated. They read a lot, they spend a lot of money on books, and they don't get enough attention, in my opinion. So much of publishing is funded by the romance genre just because this is such a switched on demographic of people, and they are reading a lot, which is why romantasy has such a huge and strong and explosive readership, because it's taking from two very established audiences. Now you can have the argument that some dedicated romance readers are not going to like romantasy because they're not going to want to bother with fantasy elements, and a lot of fantasy readers are not going to want to bother with romantasy because they just want the world building and the magic and all that kind of stuff without giving away those words to the romance plot. For me personally, I am not a romantasy reader. I still haven't found a romantasy novel that I've given 5 stars. Personally, I prefer a romance in a story which is like the C plot level. I want all the other stuff, the character stuff, the world building stuff to come first, but that's just me and my taste. But I'm still incredibly grateful to the romance genre because it's propping up so much of fiction. And the reason why that is because a lot of books don't make any money. Now, I've spoken about this concept before, and I think this is reasonably well known, but it does still surprise some people. Most novels never, ever, ever earn back their advance. Most authors never, ever earn royalties. And the reason why publishers can afford to give advances to littler authors, to debut authors, to niche literary novels that are going to lose money, that are not going to make back enough money to really justify the advance that was given to that author, the reason why they can do that is because they have these big whales that are making up most of their profit. This is exactly the same in the games industry, in the film industry. These big, huge companies are making most of their profit for a few singular things. And so this is the same in publishing. It's not just the romance genre because obviously we have the Tolkien books, we have many famous YA novels that are selling lots and lots of books, we have cookbooks and celebrity memoirs, but the romance genre specifically sells a lot of books. So what are the major books for the cozy fantasy genre and the romantasy genre? So I think for many of us, the quintessential cozy fantasy book is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, which came out in 2022. I believe it was self-published in early 2022, and then it was published by Tor in November of that same year. This was a bit of a market disruptor. It was marketed as low stakes, high fantasy, and it was really popular from the get-go. I would also probably include in here The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune, which I believe came out in 2020. This was a kind of precursor to the cozy fantasy genre, so it wasn't really marketed as cozy fantasy at the time. I think I made a video recommending cozy books, but not necessarily with the cozy fantasy epithet. Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies is another popular one, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches as well. And then for romantasy, I feel like this genre is so popular I don't even need to tell you this, but obviously the main books are ACOTAR, so A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas, and also Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. So essentially, you know it when you see it. Cozy fantasy has a lot of brighter color schemes, more, as I said, domestic houses, mushrooms, cups of tea, that kind of thing, whereas romantasy tends to be a little bit darker. For Fourth Wing, they tried to go for more of a YA cover, so this is a little bit more reminiscent of like The Hunger Games, for example, which makes sense. If you read Fourth Wing, it has a very, very YA voice, but otherwise you get a lot of like dark, swirly patterns. For example, this is the cover of Rose in Chains. I believe this is dark romance. I was going to read this for a video because I was going to do a critique on fanfic turning into trad pub deals, but then Alchemize came out. I tried to read past the first page of this and I didn't enjoy it, and I'm probably not the right person to make that video essay. So I think the rise of the romantasy genre makes a lot of sense if we look all the way back to Twilight, how popular that was as a paranormal romance, that into Sarah J Maas, into Fourth Wing, and we see this massively increasing rise in popularity. Cozy fantasy, however, I think comes out of people wanting to escape the reality that's going on around them because of real world factors like the pandemic. So as soon as the pandemic hit, I and many other people ended up making cozy book recommendations. We immediately started turning towards things that gave us comfort. Cottagecore ended up rising in popularity really, really quickly. Dark academia ended up rising in popularity because a lot of college students weren't able to go off to college, and so they started looking at romanticized ideas of academia, which brings us to the rise of cozy content. And I feel that I particularly can speak to this with a level of authority because this is one of the reasons why my channel has grown in popularity. I remember the first time that my channel was called cozy, or people started leaving comments saying, "Oh my god, your channel's so cozy," and I was a little bit surprised by the word cozy. I'd never deliberately set out to make cozy content. I like cinematography, I like warm lighting, I like sensory little details, I like zooming in on little things. That's just what I'm naturally drawn to in terms of cinema and aesthetics and all of that. It wasn't until people started actively commenting on the channel that the content was cozy that I started actively putting it into thumbnails and titles and saying cozy vlog this, cozy vlog that. So essentially what happened was I just leaned into these visual motifs that I liked, that I thought was interesting, like teacups and flowers. And as I was doing that, I was creating vlogs that were bringing people content. And also at the same time, by coincidence, because this is the stuff that I like, I started putting those details into my writing. So I love describing food. I love describing little details in houses. I love imagery. I love making things look really, really pretty. I love the idea of coming home to like a nice, warmly lit, orange lighted house after spending a day in the cold, misty blue air, right? Like I love those kinds of juxtaposing images of coziness. However, I never explicitly set out to write a cozy fantasy novel. That was never my intention, which brings us to how the cozy fantasy genre and the romantasy genre has affected me as a debut author going on submission, finding a literary agent. I'll speak to the romantasy side of this first. When I was on submission to agents with my novel Theodora's Tea Shop, I filmed a vlog of this entire process. And one of the moments that really stood out to a lot of people was this moment where I was in a call with a literary agent. It had been on submission to literary agents for months. And for those of you just backing up a little bit, if you don't know, in order to get a publishing deal at a big publisher, you need to first get a literary agent, and getting a literary agent is very, very hard. It's a long process. I already went through this experience of having spoken to another literary agent who kind of ghosted me for months and then eventually had a call with me. And then I had a call with the second literary agent. And in these two calls, I didn't get offered representation, which to me at the time was really, really disappointing, and I was really upset about it. But one of the things that the second literary agent said is that in Theodora's Tea Shop, I should add a romance. And I was so pissed off about that at the time. Like, I was just heartbroken. I felt like my book had been completely misinterpreted. I felt like this particular character was completely misinterpreted. And I was left with this kind of feeling that in order to be successful as a writer, I was going to have to betray myself and betray this character in order to achieve my dreams. I was going to have to shoehorn a romance into this just so it could have a buzzword slapped on the Goodreads page. And so I was utterly heartbroken by that. But an important point is this literary agent did not offer representation. It was the third literary agent who actually did, and then the first two came back to me and changed their mind and suddenly offered. And then I actually ended up with like 6 different offers of representation, and then we sold the book through an auction, and it was a happy ending and like an amazing outcome. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the cozy fantasy angle, which is I set out to write a book which was effectively a love letter to Howl's Moving Castle. Now, I wouldn't necessarily, I have so many copies of this book. Effectively a love letter to Howl's Moving Castle. It's a novel that I wanted to write to be just a little bit gothic. I wanted it to be very heartfelt. I wanted it to be healing. I wanted it to have a lot of atmospheric imagery. I wanted it to have this beautiful, vibrant world of demons and spirits, but I also wanted it to have a lot of twists and turns. And also, I kind of set out to write a gothic novel, which is quite funny in hindsight because no one is running with that marketing angle, I've noticed. Like, everyone has talked about it so far as being cozy fantasy. And I wouldn't necessarily label it cozy fantasy because there are moments where there are twists and turns and there are dark secrets and there are things that happen in the book that aren't particularly cozy. And so for me, on the one hand, with romantasy, I felt like I was getting pressured at one point into chasing a genre and a buzzword which I felt didn't represent my book, which I felt was a betrayal to the story I was trying to tell. But then on the other hand, another buzzword has ended up landing on my work without it really being my intention. Now, is that a problem? And that brings me to the problem with romantasy and cozy fantasy and the rise of these two buzz phrases. So I think the first major problem is a pretty obvious one with these two genres, and it's an oversaturation problem. It's not just the fact that like there's so much space now being taken up by romantasy as a genre, and just to be clear, I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. There's nothing wrong with reading romantasy and with that being your favorite genre, but I just want to look at this with a really, really critical eye. So for a reader who's not necessarily into romantasy, it might be a bit upsetting that more and more shelf space is being lost to the kinds of books that they like in lieu of romantasy becoming really, really popular. So when I talk about the problem of this, I don't necessarily mean the shelf space. I also mean the budgets of the publishers, and I also mean the desires of the agents. And the thing is, publishing is a business, and so these businesses only have certain amounts of budgets. They only have a finite amount of money that they can give out, and so they're only going to have so much money that they can use to gamble on the more experimental books, and they're going to put a lot more money into the books that they think are really going to hook the current reader, because at the end of the day, the books that are popular are not evil, they're just appealing to a lot of people, and that's absolutely fine. But the problem there is that we end up with this oversaturation where a lot of publishers and a lot of agents are going after the same thing, and it leaves out in the cold those people who are doing things that are experimental or different because there's such a smaller amount of money for those people left over. And this is not just like a corporate greed problem or like big publishing deciding what we're supposed to read. Like, I'm not saying any of that, but I do think there's also a significant problem here with algorithms and with content and with people being tacitly socialized to read the content that other people are reading just because that's what's on their For You page. So when we think about the algorithm from the perspective of the individual user, they're going to get shown all of the stuff that everyone else is already going to be shown. Content and engagement is compounding by nature, right? And so for someone like me, a content creator, I know that if I make a video essay about a really, really popular book, that's going to get more engagement. So I'm encouraged to make content about the popular content, and then that teaches other people to go and read that same thing, and then more and more people read it. And especially if it's divisive, so especially if it's a book that will irritate a lot of people but a lot of other people will love, those are the kinds of books that will really, really shoot out, because people will make content about really, really loving it, and people will make content about really, really hating it. And that's where something like Fourth Wing has really, really benefited, because a lot of people adored this book. They thought it was really, really fun, like it was a breath of fresh air, and a lot of other people read this book, they read The Voice, and they said, why did this get published? I hate this. My next really big problem with the rise of these two genres is around marketing, and it's around expectations versus reality. There's a book called Cruel Prince by Holly Black, and I picked up this book, and I think I borrowed it from the library, and I was going to read it because it was an enemies to lovers romance story, and I started reading it, hated the male main character. I was like, oh my god, this guy's really mean. I don't want to read about these two people falling in love. He's horrible. Like, why would I want to read that? I haven't actually read it in the end, so maybe I'm wrong here. I don't actually know. Apparently, it's not really a proper enemies to lovers in the sense that it's not a romance story. It's not following those same structural tropes that you have in something like Fourth Wing or that you have in a standard romance novel. So for me, I DNF'd that book because my expectations did not align with the reality of what that book is, because a marketing buzzword had been used for it. And the same thing happened to me when I was reading Chai Time in the Cinnamon Gardens. I used to have a copy of this, but I ended up donating it. It looks beautiful, right? Like, it looks very cozy. It's called Chai Time in the Cinnamon Gardens. We're seeing tea, we're seeing all these things. This is a literary novel set in Sydney which tackles really important and significant themes. In the first few chapters of this book, there are two really upsetting scenes of violence, one in which a little girl is assaulted, and it was really, really confronting to me. And so as a reader, I had heard that this book had won some awards. I went into the bookshop, I looked at it, I thought, yep, that looks cozy, that looks nice, that's what I'm in the mood for. I started reading the book and I was sucker punched by the content in this story, which is a bit strange for me because I'm not the kind of person who generally wants content warnings. Like, I read Haruki Murakami. Normally I can tolerate violence, sexual violence, that kind of thing, because I know it's coming from an author like Haruki Murakami. But with Chai Time in the Cinnamon Gardens, like, it just came out of nowhere. I was not prepared. I'd not fortified myself for it. And it really upset me, and I put the book down and I never went back to it and ended up donating it. And that's not particularly fair on the author. And I'm really sad that I didn't want to read the rest of that book because I've heard amazing things about it. But the marketing of the story, as in the cover, the title, or the colors, just did not align with the content of the book, in my opinion. And it created a really dissonant reading experience that made me ultimately DNF the book. And so when it comes to my novel, what I worry about from a marketing perspective is, are people going to go into Theodora's tea shop and expect a certain kind of story because it has a cozy fantasy tag on Goodreads? I'm really, really worried that people are going to go into that book and they're going to expect something that's very, very low stakes, where not a lot happens, where it's just like meandering scenes of people drinking tea, and none of that is my book. A lot of stuff happens. The world building is really, really deep. As I said, there are gothic elements in this story. There are parts of this story that I wouldn't categorize as cozy. However, if people regard my novel as cozy fantasy, if people want to use that buzzword, if my book accidentally benefits from a marketing buzzword, I don't really mind. Like, it's like the marketing of this story is not entirely my job. It's also the job of my publisher. And I very, very much trust my publisher. The whole team has been so amazing. So if they want to push this book as a cozy fantasy, and they haven't necessarily said that they would, but I do know several members of the team found it very, very cozy, and that was part of why they liked it. I do find it quite funny that there's this kind of full circle moment for me where, with my fiction, where it ended up being cozy, even though I didn't necessarily set out to make it cozy, if that makes sense. And finally, the final problem that I want to speak about with the rise of these two genres and how that rise has happened is that I worry how many readers are missing out on certain kinds of books because they're just being pushed cozy fantasy or because they're just being pushed romantasy. And again, that's not to say that reading either of these genres or loving these genres is a problem. It's not. The problem arises, I think, when we become siloed, when we only read within one certain kind of genre, or we only read one certain kind of author. Because the thing is that there are so many authors writing really interesting, really wonderful books. There are so many authors writing books which have small readership, which would be amazing if they got slightly bigger readerships because people tried a little harder to read outside of the pre-established genres that they already read. And I wish I had have saved this Instagram reel that I saw, but it was absolutely mind-blowing to me when I saw someone, I believe it was on Instagram, it wouldn't have been on TikTok, speaking about the fact that now in fantasy there are blue books and pink books, and I was horrified by this, but it is kind of true that nowadays romantasy and cozy fantasy are kind of seen as the fantasy novels for women, and epic fantasy, heroic fantasy, your Brandon Sandersons, that kind of thing is seen as fantasy for men. So I find this time that we're in really, really interesting because it's not just the traditional gatekeepers creating these really strong rules around genre, it's also algorithms, it's also influencers and content creators and book reviewers on these platforms. Content and engagement is compounding by nature. So moving on to how do we negate these problems? So as I said, the main problem is with expectations versus reality. It's with readers becoming siloed into genres and not being encouraged to read outside of their usual genre, even though they might find weird and interesting and wacky books with smaller readerships. If you want to avoid this problem, what I would recommend is go and get a library card, borrow a whole bunch of books, and if you start reading it, you get into the first chapter, second chapter, fifth chapter, whatever, and if you don't like it, you can DNF it with absolutely no guilt. If you borrow a book from the library, you don't spend any money, but the author does earn a little bit of money from you borrowing that book, and you can see if there's a new genre or new author you want to pick up without necessarily having to follow exactly what your For You page is recommending to you. You can do the same thing by standing in the bookstore and actually reading the blurb, standing there, reading the first couple of pages of the book. Go and pick up a random book by an author you've never heard of and see if it's the type of thing that you'll like. Also finding content creators that review and recommend books that don't necessarily have large readerships, that read and review a diverse range of books. I also have a recommendation for the content creators. So for those of us who are making content about books where perhaps our livelihood depends on us getting enough engagement and enough views, I think there's a sweet spot to be found in terms of reading the really, really popular books and also branching out and reading the smaller, less popular books as well. So for example, I'm really excited to read Catabasis Soon by R.F. Kuang. This is a really, really popular book. I know that if I make a video essay on that, it's probably going to be popular compared to if I made a video essay on a book that no one has really heard of. I'm still on the fence as to whether I am going to make a video essay on that, so let me know if that's something you want to see from me. But I also make a really, really big effort to read books by smaller authors, to put in the work to find diverse and interesting books. And then a final recommendation for the writers among you who are watching this video, which is to write the book that you want to write anyway. As I said, I never intended to write a cozy fantasy novel. I intended to write a novel which was weird and atmospheric and a little bit gothic with some cozy imagery, and it's ended up with a cozy tag on Goodreads. It is what it is. It's totally fine, and I hope people like the book. But I'm so incredibly glad that I didn't feel pressured to add a romance into the story. And the thing is that cozy fantasy could be dead in 2 years. Romantasy could be dead in 2 years. There might be some new and interesting thing that rises up in popularity. Maybe Kellyanne Bradley has started the rise in romance sci-fi novels, for example, or maybe there's going to be romance cowboy novels. Maybe romance ballad poetry. We have no idea what's going to be next. So don't feel like you need to be shoehorned into these specific genres. Write the book that you want to write. Write the book that only you can write. That's the only advice that you can really follow. At the end of the day, if you're setting out for traditional publication, you have no idea if your book's going to get a book deal anyway. So you might as well write the book that you want to write, the book that you want to read. I realize that my chair has probably slipped down as I've been making this video. So yeah, anyway, I wanted to basically talk about these two concepts. I wanted to talk about marketing and the algorithms and how all of this has affected me and my writer journey. Obviously in this video, I'm not shouting at TradPub or being particularly scathing of cozy fantasy or romantasy in any kind of way. It is quite funny that I'm speaking about divisive content and divisive books and that being the way that you get engagement. And I had to make the title of this video the problem with cozy fantasy and romantasy, because if I made a different title that was a bit more gentle or a bit more representative of the nuanced conversation I wanted to have around this, probably no one would click on it. If you'd like to see more videos like this, or if there's any specific topics you'd like me to cover, please let me know. I've really enjoyed doing this kind of deep dive on cozy fantasy and romantasy and just chatting about all of this. And also before I go, I wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone over on Patreon, because without Patreon, I wouldn't be able to be here making these videos. Over on Patreon, we have a whole bunch of lovely bonus content. We have a book club, a Discord server. I post writing updates. I post little snippets over there. So if you want to go and check out Patreon, there's a link in the description down below. My debut novel, Theodora's Tea Shop, is coming out in July next year. Pre-orders are available now, and if you can't pre-order it, please feel free to add it on Goodreads or Storygraph. Take care, everyone, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.